Cape Cod Broadcasting weaves the listening environments of 99.9 WQRC, Ocean 104.7, WFCC Classical 107.5, Cape Country 104, and CapeCon.com's website experience to reflect the lifestyles of the people who live, work, and play on Cape Cod. We hope that you enjoy this podcast.
Good morning, I'm Matt McCarthy, and you're listening to Sunday Journal. One local group is working to raise awareness about compulsive acquiring. You might be more familiar with the term hoarding, which has become well known as a result of the cable TV program Hoarders. I'm joined this morning by Denise Egan Stack. She's on the steering committee of the Cape Cod Hoarding Task Force as a mental health consultant. They're holding a few community forums coming up this week to raise awareness and support for the issue. Denise, thanks so much for joining us today on Sunday Journal.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit, kind of as a whole, what is hoarding, which is kind of a loaded question, big question, but in general, what is hoarding?
Okay. Hoarding disorder is a complex psychiatric condition that's comprised of three related problems. The first is that people acquire too many possessions. The second is that people have difficulty discarding their possessions. And the third is that people have difficulty organizing their possessions. So as a result, people are accumulating a large volume of clutter. And this clutter prevents people from being able to use their living space as intended. So people might not be sleeping in their bed or eating at their kitchen table. The clutter also creates significant health and safety risks for people, so greater risk for falling or fire. And the clutter also just makes day-to-day living much more difficult for people. So they may have more difficult cooking for themselves, bathing, paying bills, etc.
And this is just a little bit more than being a pack rat, a little bit more than being a little cluttered and messy. I mean, this is, big time, and hoarding just takes that to the next level, right?
Exactly. It is a bona fide mental health condition. In the most recent version of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is the book that we use in psychology to help us diagnose people, it moved out from under obsessive compulsive disorder as a symptom into its own category. And that's been based on decades worth of research.
And that was a recent designation?
Exactly. The DSM is updated every 20 years or so, and it was recently updated a year or two ago, and it was just this time that it was designated as its own disorder under the obsessive compulsive and related disorders category.
And Denise, you're a mental health consultant. What are some of the mental health issues that go with hoarding?
Some of the ways in which hoarding impacts a person's life?
Yes.
Okay. Well, it really impacts a person's health in many different ways. So we know, again, through decades of research that people who live in hoarded homes might be more vulnerable to respiratory illness, poor hygiene, poor nutrition. We know that people with hoarding disorder may struggle with financial problems. They may have high credit card bills because they've just been compulsively shopping or spending lots of money on their storage fees every single month. We know that people with hoarding disorder have legal issues, maybe related to not being able to pay their bills because they can't find them, or eviction. We know that people with hoarding disorder also have very strained family relationships. They're socially isolated. They're at risk for eviction, joblessness, etc.
Yeah, and this can really cause a problem, because if you think about it, you create, there's so much clutter. I mean, you can have things upon things, no matter what they are, piled up to the roof in some case. And that can present, not only a challenge, as you said, financially, but that can present a safety issue for the folks living in those homes as well, correct?
Exactly. We know that hoarded homes tend to have more mildew. Like I said, there's a fire risk. People living there at a greater risk for fall or injury because things are falling on them. So, yeah, it's significant.
And I would imagine that would also present issues for public safety officials who might come into a home, responding to a call, what have you, and then they come and they find a hoarded home, essentially.
Exactly. And many times people who are living in these homes are reluctant to call first responders because they know that if someone gets into the home, they may be reported.
And oftentimes, and correct me if I'm wrong, hoarding can be an issue that might not be well known. You might not know that a person is hoarding because they might be reluctant to call, and then all of a sudden, say, a firefighter or a police officer or EMT comes into a house and they find this situation and people didn't know about it.
Exactly. We do know that hoarding behavior starts early in age, childhood. That's not a disorder. It's just where you're starting to see the saving behavior. And then it presents as a chronic and steady course throughout life. So with each passing decade, things are getting much and much worse. And if someone's living in their own private home and they've done a nice job keeping people out, there could be a significant problem developing over the course of time that people don't know about. And then when they're in trouble, a first responder comes or, they lost water or power and they need somebody to come in and help them, it's a real problem. And then people report the authorities.
I'm Matt McCarthy. You're listening to Sunday Journal. We're joined this morning by Denise Egan Stack. She is a member of the Cape Cod Hoarding Task Force. And the Cape Cod Hoarding Task Force has an event coming up, I believe, two events this week called Buried in Treasures on the 26th. In Truro and in Falmouth. Wondering if you could just talk a little bit about those events and what you'll be doing to make the community more aware of the issue.
Sure. So the Cape Cod Hoarding Task Force was started in 2010 as an all-volunteer advisory group to help coordinate a multi-agency response to the cases that come to the community's attention, like we were just talking about. In addition to that, we also want to raise awareness in the community about hoarding disorder and to develop local resources for people affected by hoarding disorder. One of the resources that we've developed is something called a Buried in Treasures workshop. Well, we didn't develop the group, but we did bring it to the Cape. So right now I'm running a Buried in Treasures workshop here in Dennis at Elder Services of Cape Cod. And the group is a very action-oriented, structured self-help program, group-based self-help program. There are 15 sessions spread over 20 weeks, and each session focuses on a chapter in the book called Buried in Treasures, Help for Compulsive Acquiring, Saving, and Hoarding. And so in each session, we're discussing what the content of the chapter was. We're reviewing exercises that people filled out when they were reading their chapter, and we're also discussing homework assignments. And anecdotally, I can tell you that people who have gone through the group with me have called it transformative and life-changing. And, based on preliminary research, 73% of people who complete the group report being much improved or very much improved, which makes this a pretty significant resource for people here in the Cape. But what we found is that, we're in Mid-Cape. I'm at the Elder Services of Cape Cod and Dennis, and people from the Outer and Upper Cape, it could take them over an hour to get to us, which really was just an unnecessary barrier to people being able to participate in this program. So we applied for and received a grant from Mass Housing to expand this program. So later this year, we'll be working with Gosnold to be running a group on the Outer Cape and Falmouth Human Services to be running a group in Falmouth so that people will have access to this program. They don't have to travel that great distance to get the help that they need. And we want to introduce this to the communities on February 26th. So from 9:30 to 11:30, we'll be at the Truro Council on Aging. And from 2 to 4, we'll be at the Falmouth Public Library to introduce the Buried in Treasures workshop to the community and invite people to come.
And how important is raising awareness on this issue, to the community for folks who might need help? How important is awareness on hoarding?
It's extremely important. We know now that there are about 4 to 5% of people living with hoarding disorder, and people...
that's a significant number.
That is a significant number. And like you said, many times people don't really know that their neighbor or loved one really has this problem because it's happening behind closed doors. So we want to make sure that people are aware of the problem. We also want to make sure that people are aware of the fact that it is a mental health condition. It's not a moral condition. It's not that people are lazy or not trying, that it's a pretty complex psychiatric condition, and we think that that's really important so that people are treated with respect and humanely and getting the kind of treatment, evidence-based treatment that works.
And, we've heard so much from so many members of the community when it comes to mental health issues and the opiate, addiction and the opiate epidemic comes into mind. People say, well, it's a community issue. It's a community issue. I would imagine the same thing is when you have 4 to 5% of the population dealing with a hoarding issue, that it's ultimately it comes down to members of the community to help those folks. How can people go about helping folks who might be dealing with issues like this?
Well, I think that you're right. It is a significant community issue because when a case comes to the community's attention, there are a lot of resources that are devoted to helping this particular person. So if someone's at risk of losing their home, right, if it's a private home and they're at risk of losing their home, or they're living in supported housing or public housing and they're going to be evicted, they could become homeless, right? And also, while we're trying to help resolve these cases, we could have, members from the health department, first responders, legal, elder services, mental health services, all of these resources devoted to helping these cases get resolved. So it is a real significant community problem. And I think that people can help by, making sure that if they feel like somebody's struggling with this, they can refer them to the Cape Cod Hoarding Task Force, or they can call the Cape Cod Hoarding Task Force and ask for assistance on how to address the issue.
Is there a stigma that comes with hoarding? And, you think about the show Hoarders. We've all seen it. It was a very popular program. Has a stigma developed in regards to hoarding, do you think? I
think so. I think, like I said, it's important to me as a mental health professional to make sure that people know it's a mental health issue and not a moral issue. I think the stigma is people are lazy, they're just not trying, they don't care.
And, of course, when you talk about mental health issues, and that stigma has really kind of gone away over the years, but is there still an issue, still a stigma when it comes to mental health issues as well?
Of course. I mean, like you said, I think that we've come a long way, but I think we have much farther to go.
I'm Matt McCarthy. You're listening to Sunday Journal. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. I'm joined by Denise Egan Stack. She's here with us in the studio. She's from the Cape Cod Hoarding Task Force. They have two events coming up on the 26th called Buried in Treasures. As we've talked about this hoarding issue, is it more common with seniors? And I know you said you're working with Elder Services of Cape Cod. Have you seen more hoarding issues with seniors, or is it across all ages?
Well, so like I said, saving behavior starts in childhood. Average age around 13. Sometimes it's much earlier, but the average age is about 13, and then it presents as a chronic, steady course throughout life. So what happens is, at around age 50, as things have really accumulated, people then start to seek out treatment. So I think the problem is greater when people are older because they've just accumulated so much as time has gone on. In addition to that, people may have at that point in their life suffered a trauma or a loss, which can make things more difficult. People may be starting to encounter medical problems, which makes it much more difficult for them to navigate their space. They may be more unsteady on their feet. They may have knee issues. There may become, some cognitive impairment. So it's these kinds of things that as people age and, life progresses, that it gets much more complicated and much more difficult.
And that's how we lead to the extreme situations that we've seen when we think of hoarding, perhaps that we've seen on the TV show Hoarders. That's how we get to those extreme situations where stuff is just piled up to the roof.
Yeah, someone might say, well, my husband passed away, or I had a surgery, or, I filed for bankruptcy, lost my house, and all of these things make what was maybe a more manageable situation much less so.
And when you encounter folks who have an issue with hoarding, and when they're in the process of getting help and in the process of essentially cleaning out, I would imagine that can be quite traumatic at times.
Absolutely. And we really advised against cleanouts. A lot of times well-meaning people think they'll just go in and clean it up. We'll do the work. And that really is experienced as a trauma for people with hoarding disorder. And in some cases, people have even resorted to suicide because of that.
So I guess a good question to follow that up would be, if somebody knows somebody who is dealing with a hoarding issue, a loved one, a friend, a parent, you name it, what's the step? Because you say, well, maybe a clean out isn't the best step. I mean, what should they do?
Well, the first thing that people should do is really treat people with respect. I mean, a lot of times we've heard reports of eye rolling or really, mean comments, judgmental comments. And so it's really important to, again, I keep saying this, approach it as a real condition. And so people can go in there sensitively, respectfully, non-judgmentally, and sort of say, it seems like you're struggling with this. How can I help? You could be armed with resources to say, how about you read this book? Or why don't you look on this website? Or why don't we call this organization together? Here in the Cape, you could call the Cape Cod Hoarding Task Force.
And when did the Cape Cod Hoarding Task Force start? And what is the overall mission and goal of the Cape Cod Hoarding Task Force?
As I mentioned, we started in 2010. We're all volunteer. We're an advisory group, and we really wanted to help coordinate, like I said, a multi-agency response to these cases that come to the community's attention. So again, we have first responders, we have legal, we have elder services, we have health departments, and we know that when we work together, we're better coordinated. It's more likely that there's a successful resolution to these cases. So that's number one. We want to make sure that we're helping to coordinate things. We promote something called a joint service plan, which is a more formal agreement between these agencies to make sure instead of just passing the case on like a hot potato, people stay put. We really outline what their specific role is in the case and then make sure that people are following through with that, sticking through until the very end. Again, it's more likely that people will, successfully resolve their case. And then we want to raise awareness, and then we want to develop resources like expanding the Buried in Treasures workshop.
Do you know if there's a number, obviously since the organization started in 2010, is there a general sense as to how many people the organization has been able to help over the course of those 5 years?
I don't have exact numbers, but we do have a very comprehensive website that many people visit. We all answer emails and phone calls, so we get emails and phone calls every single week. And then there are active cases that we're involved in, all the time. So at any given time, there could be 3, 4, 5 or more cases that we're just kind of consulting on.
And for folks who want to learn more, they can go to the website, or they can come to the events again, which I know we mentioned earlier in the segment. But for some folks who are just listening, just joining in, wondering if you could talk again about the Buried in Treasures event coming up on the 26th.
Sure. So the Buried in Treasures workshop is a self-help group-based program that's currently being run in Dennis, and we are expanding this group to the Outer Cape and the Upper Cape. And on February 26th, we're holding free community events for people to come and learn about this group program. It's open to the public. It's for professionals, for people with hoarding disorder, for loved ones of people with hoarding disorder, just to kind of come and learn about the group. And then we'll be introducing that to people and then letting people know that they can sign up if they want to. So later this year, we'll be running one with Gosnold in the Outer Cape and one with Falmouth Human Services on the Upper Cape and Falmouth. This program is free for people.
Well, Denise Egan Stack from the Cape Cod Hoarding Task Force, thank you so much for coming in and joining us today on Sunday Journal. Unfortunately, we're just out of time, but once again, the Buried in Treasures event coming up on February 26th in Truro and in Falmouth. You can learn more at their website, and that website again?
HoardingCapeCod.org.
Well, Denise, thanks so much for joining us today on Sunday Journal.
Thank you for having me.
I'm Matt McCarthy, and this is Sunday Journal.
This podcast is a presentation of Cape Cod Broadcasting, which is solely responsible for its content. Thank you for listening. For more information, please visit us at CapeCodBroadcasting.com.